Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching India's World and I'm Vishal Dahiya. Today we're going to talk about India's leadership in the post-COVID world. Now, there are several aspects to it, specifically starting from the vaccine diplomacy. India has developed vaccine, manufactured it as well, and now we are sending vaccines to several nations, trying to help those in need at this point in time. And to have elaborate and detailed discussion on this aspect, we have with us a distinguished panel of guests. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Professor Pant, Head of the Strategic Studies Program at ORF. We also have with us Mr. Dilip Sinha, former permanent representative of India to United Nations, and Mr. K.V. Prasad, the senior journalist, is also joining us. Welcome, all of you gentlemen, to Rajya Sabha Television. Let me begin with you, Professor Pant, and let's start by looking at this situation in a holistic perspective. You know, although in the post-COVID world, a lot of things have changed and many will change further as well. But if you look at the position India holds vis-a-vis the entire world and the kind of diplomatic efforts we have or the policy we have, that clearly puts us in the league there. And we have not only used words, we have also put it into action.
Yes, Vishal, thank you. Absolutely. I think, when you look at the world today, when you look at the post-COVID world or what happened last year, it's very clear that the world is getting more fragmented, that the leadership vacuum is very palpable. Those who were supposed to be the leaders in this world order are no longer available or willing to step up to the plate. We have seen how China's role as a responsible global stakeholder came under great scrutiny last year and continues to be under scrutiny. We also know that the Western world is roiling from multiple problems internally. And the fact that the European Union is struggling with its vaccination program is a reminder how serious the crisis is in the West at the moment. So clearly, when you look at that landscape, you see India continuing to manage a crisis of this magnitude domestically. But not only that, giving leadership to the region and in some ways becoming an exemplar for the world, which is quite remarkable by any standards. From the very beginning, you saw Prime Minister Modi taking this initiative of engaging the regional stakeholders, talking to regional states. And he was the first one to talk about a regional approach first, and then even a global approach. If you recall, he was the one who called for G20 meeting very early on in this crisis. So clearly, in a sense, India has been at the very top of trying to make a case to the world that this crisis cannot be resolved by individual countries individually. We'll have to come together, and India took the lead in framing the narrative, in shaping the platforms, and in making sure that simple things like emergency medicines or PPE kits early on and now vaccination is available at a much larger scale to a large part of the world, leveraging its role as a pharmacy of the world. So what we look at, when you look at it from that perspective, you see India's role getting enhanced, not simply because of its capabilities in this particular sector in pharmacy, but also, I think, the ability and willingness of the leadership to play that role, which perhaps was missing in the past, but now it's that taking the bull by the horns approach, which I think is likely to pay dividends as the world grapples with a broader leadership crisis and therefore looks to India as a role model.
Okay, definitely. That is what the situation here is, as Professor Pant is pointing out, the world looking towards India. And India seemingly has been doing its bit here, specifically in these tough times. Let me bring in Mr. Dilip Sinha here as well. And Mr. Sinha, from your perspective, if you look at these troubled times when several nations, those be it developed or even the developing nations as well, they are facing a lot of trouble. We too had our share of difficulty for almost 6 to 8 months. We've now started to, tide over those difficulties, and we're not only, containing our efforts to ourselves, we are helping all those in need beyond the borders as well.
Yes, as Professor Pant mentioned, one of the problems that the world has been facing in recent times has been the fragmentation of the international order of the global system, and this belief that the answer to global problems lies in greater nationalism. Now, for example, a decade ago when the global financial crisis broke out, the response of the world was to move towards greater nationalism. Now, what the pandemic has shown us is that that is not the answer. the answer to global problem lies in greater international cooperation. So the response of some countries, like in the case of China, to try and cover up the pandemic and the disease, or America to try and withdraw from the WHO, is not the answer. The answer lies in greater international cooperation. And despite the magnitude of the problems that countries face, especially a country like India with its large population and its limited resources, the answer still lies in greater cooperation. So although our vaccine production, for example, is still quite limited, certainly not enough for our immediate domestic needs, we are still willing to share it globally because we realize that in this globally integrated world, we have to look at this problem globally. And this is where India has taken the lead, fortunately, in the matter of the pandemic. And this is where India should continue to take the lead, that the problems of the world today can be solved only through greater international cooperation, for which we require a rule-based international order. And that is where India should take the lead, just as it has taken the lead in the case of this pandemic with its vaccine diplomacy.
Okay. We'll talk about those other aspects as well. We'll come to other issues, not only the vaccine diplomacy or the COVID aspect. But let me first bring in Mr. K.V. Prasad here as well. Mr. Prasad, in your views, as both Mr. Sinha and Professor Pant are pointing out that India, putting its best foot forward, has basically once again reiterated our intentions to do good in the world order.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are taking it forward from where we have been building blocks over India's leadership position for a pretty long time, largely in the regional context. If I were to throw back, and what I immediately recall is that the tsunami hit these parts of the world. And that time, there were a lot of people, especially the Western powers, said, come on, we are willing to offer aid. But India at that point of time went forward and said, no, we can take up our own problems and can also address the issues of the problems in the region. So that's where you actually started showing that India has its own leadership ability and leadership in taking the region along. And I think that has multiplied several times now. And in times of a pandemic which is once in a century occurrence, India has once again demonstrated, and especially if you go back a year ago, all kind of doomsday predictions were made about India and management of the pandemic. Now, today, a year later, when we're actually taking a look back, people are complimenting India for its management of the pandemic, and also to ensure that it's playing a leadership role in kind of this medical emergencies, supplying of medicines, as Dr. Pant pointed out. There was the emergency medicines, the PPE kits, and other paraphernalia, and now with the vaccines. And I still remember the kind of focus India has had. Just about a couple of weeks ago, I received a call from a friend of mine who is in South Africa, because they are also concerned. They signed up to take medicine or vaccines from India. They were concerned about reports of some report of a ban. Of course, that was immediately clarified by the Ministry of External Affairs. And then subsequently, when there was a fire in the Serum Institute vaccine, people are very concerned that if Indian vaccine suppliers get hit, what will happen to the world? That is the kind of focus the country has today, and everybody is the leadership role is acknowledged now. But of course, in the future, we have to take it to many other fields.
Okay, definitely, and that is not only limited to dealing with the COVID pandemic or delivering vaccines or aid out there during the period when the pandemic was at its worst. There are other aspects as well. Professor Pant, I'd like to start with you. If we bring in other issues and we look at other aspects in terms of what India has been doing on the global stage, let's start with, for example, the climate change issue. Recent reports clearly point out that India has done much more than what it was required to do as per the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and that is, meeting its targets, while some other developed nations who are the maximum users there are not doing so. So clearly, that also is an aspect when we talk about the global stage and India taking the lead there.
There was a time, Vishal, you would recall, when India was lectured at by the rest of the world for not doing enough on climate change. And today, you find that the tables have been turned, and in more ways than one, India has done much more and achieved targets which perhaps other countries were supposed to undertake. and we have been much further ahead of the curve. So in that sense, the kind of leadership that was required of India on this very important issue, India has shown to the world that it is not doing because it is under pressure, and that is, I think, an important point to underscore. That it is not about India doing it under duress, or that some countries want India to do something on climate change. India is doing that. The way India has framed the narrative is very interesting. India is saying that, look, we are doing it because this is in our own long-term interest that India gets this right. Because if India has to grow and prosper, and India has to become a global leader in any respect, then it is very important that our climate change policy, our environmental policy, has to be at the cutting edge. And therefore, the kind of technologies, whether it is about framing policies, whether it is about adaptation, whether it is about green financing, all of that needs to be put into place so that a proper restructuring of a policy can take place. And that is something that I think is very important, that it has become organically Indian approach to climate change. It is not that we are being pushed by other countries into doing so. And this at a time when we saw countries like America withdrawing from Paris Climate Change Agreement. Of course, they've now come back. But the argument being that there is a lot of contestation happening on these issues in the developed world. At one point, this used to be concern that we used to have, that, look, we have to create opportunities for our lower income groups, and therefore perhaps abiding to those targets might not be most proficient aspect of this engagement. But now this is the same debate that you are seeing in America, you are seeing in Europe, as to how far to go ahead with climate change adaptation when economic crisis is looming large. And I think what India has shown a middle path in engaging on that issue. And I think India's leadership today, as you were mentioning earlier, the metrics are very clear that India has done much more and is far ahead of the curve than many anticipated a few years back.
Okay, definitely. That is also one very important aspect there. But now that we're talking about the global stage and the issues which affect people globally as well, let me bring in Mr. Sinha. Mr. Sinha, let's talk about the United Nations, and let's talk about the kind of role India is all set to play there, and our position vis-a-vis other global issues and other nations as well on that global stage.
Well, the most important stage, of course, is the UN Security Council, of which we are members for the next 2 years. And there, the promoting action against terror groups is one of the most important actions that we have to take to ensure that the laxity that had taken place in recent years is overcome. And some of these international terrorists who were excluded because of the pressure of certain countries are brought on that list. And the Security Council becomes a little more effective in its actions. We have seen how Pakistan has recently released this terrorist who was responsible for killing Daniel Pearl. So we see that the international action on terrorism is slackening in certain respects, and our presence in the Security Council should ensure that this is brought back on the center stage in the Security Council's concerns. Then, of course, we have the issue of India's membership, which we'll continue to press for, but there are issues over there that we have to keep in mind. But the other area that we have to keep in mind is that there are other international organizations, like, for example, the WHO, which we have seen came under the pressure of China, which used its big power position and its financial clout to influence the international organization. And here, countries like India, which cooperate with these international organizations, must work with them and with other countries to ensure that these international organizations remain international in character, and they abide by their mandates, and they don't come under the pressure of individual countries. Because that is the worst thing that can happen to an international organization if they start behaving like as puppets of the big powers. So there we must act and strengthen these organizations rather than weakening them, as was the case with President Donald Trump.
Okay, indeed, those are the issues. Mr. Prasad, your views there on these aspects, specifically on the global stage, and our role which India has to play in organizations like United Nations, UNSC, WHO, as Mr. Sinha was referring to.
I think in the two of these organizations, as Ambassador Sinha did mention, we are now a member of the United Nations Security Council for a 2-year term. I think one of the focus already has been made is that we are going to put our energies behind to make terrorism as a key point. And one of the things India has been advocating for a pretty long time, and I think we can try and give it a push at this stage too, is to identify and actually define terrorism, because that is something which has been talked about for a pretty long time. By definition, who is a terrorist or who is. So I think this is something that has been a quest that India has been going on for a pretty long time. Of course, terror financing has been one aspect of it, and the FATF, which is another body where we work. And when you refer to WHO again, I'm reminded that India has been now leading the executive membership, as our health minister is now head of that board in the executive category. And that's very important because WHO's analysis of the pandemic. And as we are talking, we have read reports about how the WHO fact-finding team is visiting Wuhan and the kind of restrictions they were placed on for whatever reasons. And now the fact-finding team is on the ground. And very soon we could see some kind of reportage coming out of that. So all that will find a very important place as the charter goes forward. And I think India is in a advantageous position or driver's position in both places.
Okay, and how do you assess, India's position and its actions vis-a-vis, the two issues of climate change and sustainable development there, Mr. Prasad?
Well, I think on climate change, as Professor Pant also put out, we are ahead of it. And in fact, the 2050 goals that India has been talking about, we just heard the Prime Minister articulate some of the points that we've already undertaken, whether it is shifting towards the renewable and alternate sources of energy. I think one of the biggest initiatives that India has launched is the International Solar Alliance to try and harness the solar energy potential. And in our own country, we have taken several steps to kind of re-energize or energize through alternate means, and including shifting from the more energy to more energy efficient use of electricity in day-to-day life. So all these are steps, and of course, sustainable development goals again is one area that India has very ambitious targets, and we are moving ahead, as Professor Pant also put. Several years ago, the people were always talking down to many of the developing countries and saying, what kind of development model would India and other developing countries try to take? Have a more efficient, green and clean technology, which again, clean technology would mean more expensive, or more the model which led to this kind of ozone layer problems and other depletion of greenhouse gases and other things. So I think that prescriptive model is now out. People are now seeing that India means what it does and is moving forward much ahead than many of the advanced countries had promised to, but are not doing so much.
Okay. Professor Pant, I'd like to bring you here on those issues which, both Mr. Sinha and Mr. Prasad also referred to vis-a-vis India's position on the global stage in those organizations, United Nations and India's position in UNSC and other allied organizations of the United Nations like WHO. So there are several issues there, Professor Pant, and those issues need to be dealt with. Now that India is in a very strong position and we are looked up to in various aspects, time for us to go ahead and take charge of those other important aspects and other issues as well, global issues?
Yes, and I think what we have seen, Vishal, is also a change in India's, in the way India is articulating its ambitions on the global stage, and that we saw last year very categorically when Prime Minister was addressing the UN virtually last year. He made this very interesting argument about, that this is not simply a question of India getting on board, India becoming a permanent member of the UNSC. It is a question of India's patience, which he argued that how long will India's population continue to look at, continue to think of reforms and reforms which are not happening? How long can you test the patience, in effect, he was trying to say. And what he was, I think, articulating was, this sense of frustration that you feel about the larger global governance issues, where for a country like India, it is not simply a question that India needs to sit on that table. It is also a question of the very credibility of UN Security Council. So the more the more difficult it becomes for countries like India to sit there, the less credibility UN Security Council will enjoy. And so it is not, I think, what India is now saying is that on critical issues of global governance, India's voice, of course, is important. But what is important for the global governance institutions is to think about their own credibility. And for UNSC in particular, if it does not involve the voices of countries like India, then for after a while, already we are looking at the great fragmentation. Already we are looking at great power contestation happening on UN Security Council between West and Russia and China. If countries like India are not involved, if countries like India that are showing leadership are not involved, then I think the whole idea of global governance faces its own reckoning in some ways. So the challenge, I think, is as much for India in trying to articulate its own vision of the global governance, as the challenge remains for these global governance organizations and platforms to create that space for India. And I think that is a very interesting shift that we have seen in India's articulation, because it is now we are not simply, we are not asking those institutions simply to give us a place. We are also demanding that accountability needs to be restored, and that if countries like India are not part of it, then I think the larger question of those of the institutions' credibility is at stake. So when we are looking at issues ranging from terrorism to climate change to sustainability, we are looking at a range of issues where India can't be ignored, and India is not being ignored. If you look at the kind of minilateral platforms that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific, for example, these are organic platforms that are coming up because multilateral institutions are in short supply, or they are not becoming very effective. So clearly for India, will chart its own course, and as the vacuum becomes much more palpable, we will see India's role becoming even more important than before.
Okay, that sums it up. But let's also take a quick concluding comment from Mr. Sinha here before we bring this discussion to an end. And Mr. Sinha, in your views, the road ahead in terms of India's, position on the global stage, and the challenges and opportunities therein.
I think what we should be doing is, as Professor Pant mentioned, the issue of representation of India on the international stage is very important. But equally important is, I think we should keep emphasizing that right now what is happening is that politics is all power-based, and power decides what kind of position you have in the UN. That should change into more of value-based. Do countries share the objectives of the United Nations? Objectives like democracy, human rights, respect for international law. These should be the criteria that should decide how influential a country is on the international stage. And the UN must adapt itself to these. And this is what we should be promoting on the global stage to promote our role there.
Okay, there it is. Thank you so much, Mr. Dilip Sinha, Professor Harsh B. Pant, and Mr. K.V. Prasad as well, for sharing your views with our viewers here on this important aspect. As our panelists were pointing out, India no longer can be ignored on the global stage. We have done a lot in various aspects, be it dealing with the COVID pandemic or dealing with the global issues of importance like climate change, sustainable development. But then there are several challenges, and India will have to keep on, proving its mettle there on the global stage, which we are already on various aspects. We'll come back again next week with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.